In 1849, the Toronto Globe stated that slavery never had an existence in Canada. Unfortunately, despite this assertion remaining unchallenged, slavery had existed in Canada. Among many native tribes in Canada, slaves were made of captured enemies. When the French arrived in Canada, they purchased these panis for use in their labor force. Black slaves were first brought to pre-Confederation in Canada in 1608 by the French. In 1629, Albert Le Jeune was the first slave brought directly from Africa to Canada, although he apparently died a free man. Despite the efforts of many entrepreneurs, the African slave trade never took off in Canada. A mining enterprise that had begun in 1677 had a labor shortage, and because of this, Governor Denonville convinced France to allow the importation of slaves. With this legal basis for slavery, it would seem that the French might have demanded more African slaves. They may have done so, but the deliveries of African slaves were effectively interrupted by the uncertainty resulting from King William's War and later the War of Spanish Succession. In 1704, France abandoned its colonial development policy, which meant that there would be no deliveries of slaves to New France. Despite this, by 1759 there were 3,604 recorded slaves in New France, of which 1,132 were black. Slavery expanded in Nova Scotia after 1783, when American loyalists brought their slaves with them as they fled the colonies. The larger percentage of blacks who arrived in Nova Scotia after the American Revolution, however, were free. Canada's low rate of slave holding had as much to do with a lack of initiative as it had to do with the unsuitable nature of Canada's agricultural system and the mere fact that slaves were an expensive investment. British North America and Quebec were unlike the southern states, which relied on the brutal slave labor of the plantation system. Upper Canada's farming system was mainly comprised of family farms. Most farmers in Upper Canada wrestled with clearing the land, surviving, and creating a surplus. A slave was a luxury that the average farmer could not afford, and for any Canadian to possess more than 2 slaves was rare. In Quebec, the seigneurial system was firmly in place, and although there was a desire for slaves to work the land, there never was a need. Slaves could have conceivably displaced peasants as Quebec's farm labor, but there simply were not enough blacks, and they were far too expensive. Due to their expense, slaves were mainly clustered among the rich families as personal servants in Canada's metropolitan areas, or on the wharves unloading ships. Slavery never formed the basis of the Canadian economy, and this meant it was much easier for slavery to be condemned by anti-slavery advocates. This also meant that average Canadians would not likely have strong opinions concerning the morality of slavery, as it did not affect their environment very much. This would have an important impact on the abolition movement in Canada, as early abolitionism in Canada was the expression of a small but influential minority. Considering that slavery did not form an essential place in Canada's pre-Confederation economy, it took quite some time for Canada to effectively put an end to its own slavery. The Quebec Act of 1774 contained no provisions against slavery. This was probably due to the effort of Guy Carleton to appease the French as much as possible to ensure their loyalty to the Crown. The old social order of Quebec would not be disturbed. When John Graves Simcoe introduced an act in 1796 to gradually eliminate slavery in Upper Canada, the slave trade was effectively smothered in Upper Canada. This did not mean that slavery itself ceased to exist in Canada. The act merely proposed gradual emancipation, and because of this, no slaves were actually freed by the act. As a concession to slaveholders, it ensured that current slaves would continue to live in servitude. The act also forbade the importation of slaves and freed the children of slaves at the age of 25. This was disturbingly ironic, as the life expectancy for the average slave in Canada was only 25.2 years. In New Brunswick, Solicitor General Ward Chipman prepared a particularly thorough attack against slavery in the case of Nancy Morton. Although he lost the case and Nancy Morton remained a slave, the mood of many in the Maritimes towards slavery seemed to be shifting. Similar shifts occurred in Upper Canada and Quebec. Owners, perhaps moving to protect their investments, freed their slaves into a limited time of indenture, or began to pay them as laborers. The last known slave purchases occurred in 1806 in Upper Canada, in 1807 in Nova Scotia, and 1809 in New Brunswick. In 1816, an advertisement offering a reward for the return of an escaped slave was printed in New Brunswick. Advertisements for fugitive slaves ceased to appear in Quebec in 1821 and in Halifax in 1820. Slavery was almost completely eliminated in Canada by the 1820s. 13 years later, the legislation abolishing slavery would be initiated, and on August 1st, 1834, slavery would be abolished in all the British colonies. Canada appears to have been ahead of all the other British colonies in the emancipation of slaves. Canada's location played an important role in Canada's involvement with the abolition movement. The close proximity of the United States to Canada ensured that Canadians were well aware of the effects of their neighbors' slavery. Anti-slavery often had an anti-American character to it. The Loyalists who settled in Canada with their slaves soon became embarrassed at retaining an institution they closely associated with republicanism they had fled. The anti-American nature of the abolition movement was also reflected in the British North American response to slavery. The reforming politicians who would furiously denounce American slavery were seen as interfering, anti-business, and anti-American by the conservative leaders. The best way for Canada to get along with their southern neighbors, according to these leaders, was to ignore their dirty laundry. Canada's location had further importance in the abolitionist movement. During the early 19th century, blacks trickled across the border of British North America. In 1850, this trickle became a stream when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in the United States. This law authorized slaveholders to pursue escaped slaves into non-slave states, to capture them, and to take them back to their plantations. With the passage of this law, southern Ontario became the main destination for fugitive slaves, who now fled from both the slaveholding states and the non-slaveholding states. These fugitive slaves didn't escape discrimination in Canada, but they did escape slavery. It is estimated that by the 1850s, a third of the 25,000 blacks in Canada were escaped slaves. It was not until the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law that the anti-slavery movement in British North America truly gained momentum, and abolitionist sentiments were put into action. The fugitive slaves were aided by the Underground Railway, a network of abolitionists throughout North America who delivered the slaves safely to Canada. Once in Canada, anti-slavery advocates such as the Reverend William King and Mary Ann Shadd Carey fought against prejudice and unfair land distribution on behalf of the black community.